I recently watched a clip from a longer interview that was produced by a YouTuber. Do we call them YouTubers? I guess they're called influencers. Right? I don't know. It's a strange world we live in. I guess I'm a YouTuber, technically. I'm not as popular as Ruslan. So I listened to a video from Ruslan. I think that's how you pronounce it. It might be Ruslan, but in the video clip, someone says his name at the beginning, and I heard it's pronounced Ruslan. So I'm going to say that. I apologize if it's wrong. Ruslan, over 80,000 subscribers, very influential, very popular. And he recently had Dr. Flowers on his show, and they did a long interview. I haven't seen the longer version of the interview. So if anybody who's watching this if any of my concerns and criticisms are dealt with further at length, you should let me know. That said, this is a short 12-minute clip of Dr. Flowers asking or answering questions that are submitted to him from the listeners. And someone asked him about his take on the American Gospel documentary. Now, I've seen the American Gospel documentaries. They made a first one, and then they also made a second one on different issues. And this apparently is about the first one. Now, it's funny, this person must not have seen Dr. Flowers did a review of American Gospel. Maybe it's like an hour 40. It might be 2 hours and 40. I can't remember. He did a long review on it. I didn't watch that video either, and so I clicked on this. It'll be just get a quick 12-minute soundbite. But boy, was I in for a surprise for a couple reasons. Number one, he doesn't really talk about American Gospel in this clip. He says something briefly about it, but then he just immediately jumps into critiquing Calvinism. The reason I had to do a video on this is as he was talking about American Gospel and then about Calvinism, he started addressing this interesting issue that I've heard a lot of people talk about, which is that in more recent church history, at least since the time of the Reformation, since the time that the Calvinist-Arminian debate has been happening, there's so few non-Calvinistic theologians that are like really worthwhile, right? Like when we think of some of the heroes of the faith over the last 500 years, they're almost all Calvinists. Not all of them, but almost all of them. Like all of the major, deep, scholastic, academic, theological works, the confessions and the commentaries and the sermons and the evangelists, all these things, they're almost all Calvinistic. And so I think it is a good question if someone like a Dr. Flowers doesn't want people to think that non-Calvinistic soteriologies are shallow or novel or whatever. This is a helpful thing to be asked, and it's a helpful thing to answer. But his answer was atrocious. Historically, it was just egregious. So I'm going to let him play this whole clip. It's 3 minutes long, so it's going to be kind of a long time of him talking, but I don't think it would be good to interrupt him. So I'm going to let him say his piece about why we don't have more prominent non-Calvinist theologians, and then I'm going to explain why I think it's such a problematic answer. Just to give some context to the clip briefly, he just got done, he's in the middle of actually talking about how many people today, many Calvinists today, have a character in their heads of non-Calvinists. And this character is that they don't have deep exegetical works, that they don't take the Bible very seriously, they're not theologically very smart. So that's what he's saying, and that's what he's in the process of talking about. So here's Dr. Flowers.
And they paint Arminians and non-Calvinists all in this very caricatured way to make us seem like we're dumb, that we're goofy, that we don't have really any in-depth exegetical commentary on the verses that they're always quoting from. And that could not be more false. I used to think that when I was a Calvinist. I used to think that Arminians just, they meant well. They're good pragmatists. They're good at preaching and loving people and being pastoral, but they're just not very deep exegetically. They're just not really deep thinkers. And it wasn't until I started studying that I began to realize just the opposite is the case. The deepest, most robust thinkers throughout Christian church's history have not been Calvinist in my experience, in my studies. They've been non-Calvinist, but they've been buried over the course of human history. Why? And again, this is going to step on some toes, but it's just a fact of the matter. Calvinists tend to be theological bullies. Throughout church history, the Calvinists are the ones who would burn the Anabaptists at the stake and throw them into the river and burn up all their books. And so you look back throughout church theological history, you don't see a lot of the free willers because the free willers are pacifists. The free willers are I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It just totally went out of my brain. But who would teach, like one of the Anabaptists would teach, we should win people over with love and patience, not with fire and sword, because this is what Jesus did. Jesus was patient. Jesus was loving. Jesus was kind. So we shouldn't kill our enemies. We shouldn't kill the dissenters, theological dissenters. This is why did he believe this? He said, we believe this because we should be patient with people because their wills might change. We could convince them. And so we don't want to kill them before we give them full opportunity to repent. And so they would argue this from their free will theology. But guess what happened to them under Zwingli? Under Zwingli's rule, they would get killed. And their books would be burned up. And so, looking back through theological history, it looks like overwhelmingly just Reformed and Calvinistic and all kinds of stuff. Why? Because Calvinists tended to be the theological bullies throughout the years, and they tend to bury all the scholars from the other side, literally, sometimes, unfortunately. Now, again, don't hear me say that I think people like Piper or others would do that today. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that particular way of thinking often attracts with it very bullyish type of people that come a part of that systematic, and they're the ones oftentimes who lead the charge and can become theological bullies and silencing their opponents.
This is really bad. Let me just briefly summarize and then explain why it's so bad. So his answer essentially boils down to this: there were a lot of theological giants, of theological masterpieces that were produced. Specifically, he mentions the Anabaptists, by the Anabaptists. We're going to get into that in a minute. The Anabaptists were part of the Reformation. They were known as the radical reformers, as opposed to the first reformers who were called the magisterial reformers. So the magisterial reformers referred to the Anabaptists as radical reformers, reforming too far, going a little too far. There was an Anabaptist movement, which continues today, and the Anabaptists were persecuted by the Reformed community. And so his essential answer is that they do exist, but they were destroyed and they were persecuted, and so that's why they're not popular. That's why there's not very many of them. That's why we don't have as much writings. And let me say a few things. Number one, it's interesting. He used terms like throughout human history and throughout the history of the church, but clearly what he has in mind is only Reformation history. A lot of things happened in the first 1,500 years of the church. There was a lot of theologians in the first 1,500 years of the church, and many of those theologians, to speak anachronistically, were not Calvinists. So it's interesting why he would limit himself. I think the question itself forced him to limit that. The question itself is asking about a particular time frame, right? The word Calvinism and the word Arminianism doesn't really have meaning prior to the Reformation. Those doctrines were in the church and debated ever since the days of the apostles. But those titles, those terms, those packages didn't exist until the Reformation. So I understand the question itself is sort of asking about the last 500 years without even knowing it. But nonetheless, he's the one who used the terms like throughout the history of the church. And it may have just been a slip of the tongue. I don't want to make a big deal about this. The only reason I bring it up is because I would think if I was trying to dissuade a Reformed theologian from thinking that you're only smart and you're only deep and you're only exegetical if you're a Calvinist, my personal line of attack, if I were attacking that caricature, would be to go before the Reformation and just mention how many patristics were not Reformed thinkers and yet were deep thinkers and contributed in really profound ways to the church. I mean, you think of a guy like Chrysostom. He's considered a church father, so he was influential, he was smart, he was deep. And you read his commentary on Romans 9, he is not what we would today call a Calvinist by any stretch of the imagination. Now, here's why I don't think Dr. Flowers would ever want to do that. Remember, he doesn't claim to even be an Arminian. He has theological differences with classical Arminians. When you look at his distinctiveness from classical Arminians, so I'm not talking about Arminians in general, I'm talking about his views, which he calls provisionism. Provisionism is found in church history before the Reformation, and it's specifically found in the condemnations of the Council of Orange. titled under semi-Pelagianism. I'm going to do a separate video on this. Leighton Flowers, he has heard this before, and he thinks it's boogeyman. He thinks it's just name-calling. And that's potential. Maybe that's what it is. But based on what I read from that council about semi-Pelagianism, he seems to fit the bill. So I'm going to do a separate video on that. But another reason why I don't know if he's comfortable putting too much leverage in all of the pre-Reformation theologians is because most of them were sacramentalists. Right? They weren't Baptists. They had a lot of views that Dr. Flowers would be offended by. Take that for what it's worth. But let's get to the more important stuff. That's kind of more of a tangent. The more important stuff is this. Is it true what he claimed, that the Calvinists were bullies and that the Calvinistic system really creates and attracts bullies, and that's the reason why there's not these great theological works today? Is it true that the Calvinists of the 16th century were to some degree bullies? Yes, that's true. Although I don't know much I'm not a Reformation scholar. I'm not an Anabaptist scholar. I don't know much about them. I only know about Zwingli. I know that Zwingli persecuted the Anabaptists. Zwingli had at least one of them drowned, but I'm sure it was more than one. So yes, Zwingli especially was not a fan of the Anabaptists, and they would put them to death as heretics. And the Anabaptists were not liked by the Reformed community. So it is true, there was a level of what he's calling being a bully, right? That's probably even putting it lightly. We have a handful of problems here. So the first one is this: correlation doesn't equal causation. He said that the reason there's no great theologians, free will theologians, because the Calvinists put them all to death and burned their works. And then he even ended it by saying, now I'm not saying John Piper and other Calvinists would do that to me today, but he did say very clearly but the system attracts that mentality, maybe even creates that mentality. So let's start with that. Let's begin the refutation to start with that. Is that a fair assessment of the data? Is that a fair conclusion of the data? And the answer is emphatically no. Absolutely not. And here's why I say that. I have a good book on the Anabaptists. This is a book called The Anabaptist Story by William Estep. I don't know how you pronounce that. And he is, by the way, speaking very favorably about the Anabaptists. And the reason we have to mention that is, let me tell you something about the Anabaptists. First Anabaptists, Conrad Grebel, for example, were trained under Zwingli. Part of the reason why they were so smart is because they learned from the Calvinists. They started to take issue as they began learning and diving in with all the other students of the Reformers. They began to take issue. And the original ones, the first ones, were pretty tame. And they would have views that many people today have. They would have views on not baptizing infants, views that the church and state should be separate. We shouldn't kill heretics, as Dr. Flowers pointed out. So they did have a lot of views that people are sympathetic to today, that people hold today. But the Anabaptist movement went off the rails pretty fast, and we'll discuss more of that later. But this is not like an anti-Anabaptist guy. This is a guy who's very pro-Anabaptist, and he wrote a book trying to defend them. And so obviously in the book, he documents their persecutions. And I've read about the persecution of the Anabaptists in other places as well. And here's what's interesting. Is it true that Zwingli and the Calvinists persecuted them as heretics? Yes, that is true. But here's the problem. In this book, there were other groups that persecuted the Anabaptists. For example, one of them were the Lutherans. The Lutherans also would kill Anabaptists. The Lutherans also considered the Anabaptists heretics. The Lutherans would imprison the Anabaptists. The Lutherans were persecuting the Anabaptists. And the Lutherans are they Calvinists? No, they're not. They're not Calvinists. Lutherans have far more in common with Arminian soteriology than they do with Calvinistic soteriology. So we have quasi-Arminians who are also bullying the Anabaptists, who are also violent towards Anabaptists. But it doesn't stop there, because remember, there was an organization that preceded what we call Lutherans and Calvinists. And this organization has a lot of blood on its hands. And not just Anabaptist blood. They killed a lot of Calvinists. They killed a lot of Reformers. And who were they in the 16th century? Oh yeah, that's right. The Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church killed a lot of people, bullied a lot of people. Let's ask about the Roman Catholic soteriology. Were they Calvinists? Answer, no. Anti-Calvinists. The Roman Catholics are not Calvinists. So notice, in the 16th century, we have a lot of people bullying each other. We have a lot of organizations and leaders killing people, killing heretics, and most of them are not Calvinists. So how is it that he looks at Calvinist persecution of the Anabaptists and determines they're bullies? Their system attracts bullies, when non-Calvinist soteriology apparently attracts bullies at a greater measure. The Roman Catholic Church was killing a lot of people, and they agree with Dr. Flowers on a lot of soteriology. They would disagree on all 5 points of Tulip, and Dr. Flowers agrees with only one of them, to my knowledge. So they're pretty close. They're not Calvinists, and they're bullies. So this is just really bad history. The problem was obviously societal and cultural. Everybody just thought you killed heretics. But this was what everyone was doing. That's just what you did. I'm not saying that justifies it. I'm not saying that makes me happy. But what I am saying is we can't single out Calvinistic persecution and say, see, it's a bunch of bullies over there. I understand that that works on people because we live in a day and age where feelings and emotions matter more than argumentation. If you don't believe me on that, then you need to read Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's very true. My feelings essentially determine truth in this day and age. And this has crept into the Christian church more than we would like to admit. So there are lots of Christians out there who are going to be convinced by this kind of argumentation. Should I be a Calvinist or should I not be? Well, Dr. Flowers says the Calvinists were really mean. So I'm not going to be a Calvinist because they were really mean in the 16th century. Well, so were the Lutherans and so were the Roman Catholics, right? Like, this isn't a Calvinist issue. This was a cultural issue of the 16th century, and it's no longer a cultural issue because none of these groups want to kill each other today. So he is trying to blame Calvinism on something that Calvinism is not responsible for. However, there's an even, I would argue in my mind, an even more important thing to mention here. The crux of his argument was not that Calvinists are bullies. The crux of his argument was that the reason we don't have any famous non-Calvinistic works, any famous non-Calvinistic theologians is because the Calvinists got rid of all of them. And that I even think is actually not true. First and foremost, let me just say there are tons of non-Calvinistic groups that the Reformers didn't kill. Arminius and the Remonstrants, the Lutherans. There's a lot of non-Calvinistic works, right? Do you think any Lutheran would agree with what he said? The Lutherans are over here going, hello, Dr. Flowers, right? Like, we have a ton of theologians that go back to the Reformation, tons of works, tons of great theologians. They have an entire confessional system. Confessional Lutherans have the Augsburg Confession. So it's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. The fact of the matter is that there really are not very many people up until the very modern contemporary day that think like Dr. Flowers and his disciples. That's just true. That's the case. But another thing that's really important to mention is let's talk about the Anabaptists and kind of help make this case a little bit better. He immediately jumped to the Anabaptists as his... Oh no, when I started studying, I realized that the deepest thinkers are actually non-Calvinists. Some names would have been nice. It would have been really nice to know who he was talking about. All he mentioned were the Anabaptists. And here's all I'm going to say. If you want to claim the Anabaptists as your theological forebears, go for it. I don't want them. I don't know very many people who have read the Anabaptists who do want them. So if that's your argument, like, oh yeah, I know you've got Calvin and Zwingli and Beza and Turretin and you've got even more contemporary guys like Spurgeon and Gill on the Baptistic side. And I know you've got all of these amazing theologians, but trust me, there are better ones out there. The Anabaptists. And just do some reading on the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, by the way, very quickly spiraled into, they were like the 16th century version of Bethel. It got pretty crazy. But as I already said, the early movement was fairly solid and understandable, and many of us today would certainly be sympathetic to it. But here's the problem. He described the Anabaptists as being kind of like the free willers of the 16th century. I would like to see some proof of that. I'm not denying it. Again, I'm not an Anabaptist scholar. I will say nothing in this book that I read here, at least, says anything that these men rejected Calvinism. Remember, the early Anabaptists, some of them were Roman Catholic priests who converted, but the main ones who led the movement, they were students of Zwingli. And they started disagreeing with some of Zwingli's theology. The Reformers started responding to their new theology and condemning them for it. And Everything that I've read, Calvinism never came up. If you read through this book, it documents. It even quotes some primary sources, some of the things that they were being persecuted for, some of their theology that they took issue with the Reformed leaders. And here's some of the things that they were condemned for. Let's start with the ones that are not controversial. They disagreed with the Reformed view of the Lord's Supper. They thought it wasn't memorialist enough. They wanted just like a pure memorialism, and the Reformed were kind of arguing for like a spiritual presence. So they wanted a memorial view of the supper, and they thought the supper was still being practiced too gaudy. It was still too Roman Catholic. They wanted what they thought was more apostolic, more primitive, which is kind of a simplified version of the Lord's Supper. So they were condemned for their views on the Lord's Supper. The big one, the one that many people who don't know anything about the Anabaptists, they at least know this. The Anabaptists were the first Credo Baptist community. So they were condemned on their views of baptism. That after the Reformers came out of Rome, they broke from the Lutherans and from Roman Catholics on baptismal regeneration. But as we know, the Reformed community up until the particular Baptists all practiced infant baptism. And the Anabaptists were the first to reject that. They rejected infant baptism. And then they were condemned for their pacifism. They were pacifists. The later Anabaptists became much more pacifistic, it seems, than the original ones. The original ones were more pacifistic than Rome and the Reformers, for sure. But I don't know if they were like full-fledged, no violence under any circumstance kind of pacifists. But nonetheless, the Anabaptists were pacifistic. They didn't believe the state should kill heretics. They weren't fighters. And that was actually seen as a big error. So far, they're being condemned by the Reformed community and the other communities as well for things that have nothing to do with Calvinism. We have no evidence that the early Anabaptists disagreed with Calvinism. The only other things that they were charged with was sedition, which, because in the time of the Reformation, one of the things that the Reformers believed, which modern day Reformers don't even believe, was that the church and state were basically, for the sake of simplicity, one and the same, that they were blended. The Anabaptists wanted to see a separation between the church and state, and so that was seen as an act of sedition. It's basically being a traitor. So they were condemned for sedition. And then a big theological controversy was apparently many of them were condemned for their Trinitarian views. Many of them were accused by the Reformers of not having an orthodox view of the Trinity. And there's some debate about whether that's true or not. But whether that's true or not is actually beside the point here. The point here is, so the story that Dr. Flowers has created is that the Anabaptists were the free will Baptists and the Calvinists crushed them. But I have no recollection. I didn't read anything as they were listing their complaints against the Reformers. Calvinism didn't come up. Baptism comes up. Church and state comes up. The Lord's Supper comes up. Calvinism doesn't come up. This was not like this was this bastion of free willers that the Calvinists trampled. Now, it is true that the Anabaptist movement continues today in two very different forms. There's what we call the Plymouth Brethren, and they maintain the pacifism in the very simplified version of church that the Anabaptists eventually evolved into. And then there's like these hardcore liberal Anabaptists. The most famous one is a pastor in Canada named Bruxy Cavey. And if you look him up, you'll see very, very liberal, basically borderline open theism. So modern day Anabaptists are not Calvinistic. They're very anti-Calvinistic. So I don't doubt that somewhere in the evolution of the Anabaptist movement, they eventually became non-Calvinists and very anti-Calvinistic. Here's what Dr. Flowers needs to do. He needs to show when that happened and prove that there were these theological giants that were also not Calvinistic that the Reformers were destroying, and for their non-Calvinism. I'm not trying to be too dogmatic because I'm not an Anabaptist scholar. But based on what I've read, I don't have any evidence to suggest that these men were free will Baptists. They weren't being killed for their soteriological views. They were being killed for their ecclesiological views. The issue was ecclesiology, not soteriology. If I went back in time, Zwingli would want me gone too, and I'm a Calvinist. So again, is his point true that there were these theological giants, free willers, but we just don't know much about them because they were buried? There's probably some truth to that, but I think largely that's not true. He essentially made two claims in this clip. Claims that there were these incredibly brilliant, deep, exegetical, non-Calvinistic theologians in the Reformation that we just don't know anything about, but the Calvinists killed them. I don't think that's true. I don't think that the Anabaptists were that incredibly deep and sophisticated, and the ones that were, I think, probably leaned more towards Calvinism. And then he claimed that Calvinists were bullies. Calvinism breeds a bully mentality, that this happened. But again, we proved that's not true, because the Lutherans were bullies too, and the Roman Catholics were bullies too, and they're not Calvinists. So Calvinism is not the problem to the bully culture of the 16th century. And before I conclude, let me just read from Estep here. He has a whole section on Anabaptism and compares it to Reformation theology, and he never once says that the Anabaptists were against Calvinism. But what's interesting is, while he does admit that part of what we're missing in this Anabaptistic movement is due to the Reformers' persecution, and not just the Reformers, the persecution of that people as a whole. But he actually says something interesting separately as to why we don't have it. And I think it's a problem for Dr. Flowers. Here's what he says. And as a rule, Anabaptist theologians did not live very long, nor did they erect elaborate speculative systems of theology. The primacy of the scriptures in Anabaptist life discouraged the formulation of creeds that would tend to take precedence over the Bible. Anabaptist confessions of faith were also rare and without binding quality. They were nothing more than the term implies, confessions of individuals or small groups of the brethren. What do I want to point out? Notice he says, part of why we don't have a lot of these great scholars and their works is because they didn't live very long. But he doesn't say, therefore. He says there's another reason. There's a second reason why. As a rule, Anabaptist theologians did not live very long. Therefore, no, they did not live very long, nor, here's another reason. And he says it's their theology's to blame. It's because their theology discouraged them from writing these kinds of things. Now, again, this still says very high things. He says, however, the early confessions, sermons, hymns, and other literary expressions of faith form an extensive body of material. The 20th century student is able to draw from them a picture of 16th century Anabaptist theology. So he's saying we do have a lot of information. These bully Calvinists didn't ruin it all. We have an extensive library from the Anabaptists. It's not that deep. It's not that impressive. It's not better than the Reformed library. And part of the reason why we don't have so many more great extensive works is because the kind of theology they were promoting didn't promote writing those kinds of things. So I think that Dr. Flowers is way off here. Historically, I think this is a mess. I think it's such a mess and it's very misleading. There is some truth to this that I just want to also give credit to, because I do think that some Reformed thinkers tend to think that anyone who's not a Calvinist is just a total idiot, and that's not the case at all. Because I've thought through this in a related issue. So this issue comes up in a similar vein within the Reformed community, specifically as it pertains to the Credo Baptists and the Paedo Baptists. And there's kind of a joke where it's we have these modern day Reformed Baptists. He mentioned John Piper by name. John Piper would be one. John Piper's a Calvinist, but he's not a Paedo Baptist. He doesn't baptize infants. But all of John Piper's Calvinistic heroes did baptize infants. And throughout the Reformation history till today, we don't have a lot of Reformed Credo Baptists. I mean, there are a lot, but not of them. They're not very special. Not like the Paedo Baptists. We've got John Gill, who some people think is a hyper-Calvinist, so maybe he's not the best. And you've got a guy like Spurgeon, but Spurgeon was more known for his preaching, not so much like his theological insight, although he was smart, right? So as a Reformed Baptist, shouldn't you get rid of the baptism part because all the smart guys are Paedo? And I think rather than saying, well, it's because they're bullies, what I do think is a reasonable historical answer that would apply to Dr. Flowers as well, is that back then they didn't have YouTube. They didn't have blogs to put in the time it takes to write a systematic theology. Like you think of Turretin's 3-volume eclectic theology. You think of Calvin's multi-volume Institutes of Christian Religion on top of his commentary on nearly every book of the Bible. This takes a lot of time and a lot of research. You need a job that can support you in that work, and you need people who are going to publish it Because remember, again, they didn't have printers the way we do today. I mean, to get something published and to do the research for it was a big deal. You had to have connections and resources. And a lot of the Baptists didn't have that because their view was minority. The Roman Catholic Church was not excited to print a bunch of Baptist systematics. It took a lot of resources to do this, and not a lot of groups had those resources. So I think that's a fair answer. I think that's a more historically accurate and balanced answer. Notice what Ruslan says, and it's not very helpful to what Dr. Flowers is trying to do.
Is just a distinction you made between how and what. That to me, there seems a degree of acknowledgement to paradox, more of a degree in acknowledgement to paradox, and more of a degree of saying, I don't necessarily need to know how to know what. Everyone, and where the Calvinist position is trying to give you a how answer, and it creates this certainty and this fundamentalism and having an answer for every single question, and your theology fits in this nice little this little puzzle, and it all just beautifully fits together. When I don't know anybody that would read the scriptures, even read the scriptures in context, understand the Hebrew and the Greek, that would be like, oh yeah, like I get this very nice puzzle of theology that just all fits beautifully together.
What did he just got done saying before? He criticized, and people do this a lot, Calvinists are criticized for having a systematic theology. They're criticized for, they're not okay with mystery, they're not okay with not knowing, they want to fit everything into these nice little bubbles. But that actually kind of goes against everything Dr. Flowers was trying to do. That actually feeds the stereotype, right? Because what is he essentially saying? He's saying, listen, Calvinists have the answers, they're trying to have the answers, they're trying to fit pieces together, they're trying to figure it out, and that makes them fundamentalists. So just be like the non-Calvinists and just don't have the answers. Don't try to figure it out. Don't try to piece it all together in this beautiful systematic. And then they wonder why. Why is it that so many Calvinists have this perception of non-Calvinists that they don't take the Bible seriously and that they're not exegetically deep? It's because we hear things like this. And I bet you Dr. Flowers was thinking this and he just didn't want to be rude, and props to him for that. I understand that. And Dr. Flowers is not like that. Dr. Flowers does give a lot of answers, and he's very deep and he's very exegetical and he's very smart. But yeah, you see that you get this kind of rhetoric from non-Calvinists a lot, and it doesn't help the non-Calvinist side. So I'm sure that he was dying inside, or I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting, and maybe I don't know. If Calvinists are going to be criticized for trying to have a neat systematic theology that ties up loose ends and brings everything together, I'm actually not embarrassed by that, and maybe that is why our theologians are so prominent for the last 500 years.